Why were you late? Remember before you enter that you will not leave. The day I discovered reading, the television was turned off. I was about 10 years old, and at that crucial moment in my life, I felt lost and felt that my sight had been taken from me because I was not like the other children who played football, passionately in the street or riding their bikes, moving from one alley to another, collecting their life experiences through practice and direct contact with their peers. I had my own world, which was disturbed by the malfunction of that television. I went to my father to ask him to fix the television to restore my only window to the world to its previous state, because I was in the first day and the TV was still on. The end of the school day is like a magic box that provides me with doses of suspense and excitement, which I always craved because at that time I did not have a hobby to entertain myself with or in my free time, which was and still is a vessel that empties quickly, and my obsession is always filled despite. He responded quickly, but I was disappointed when I learned after his father returned in the evening that the device would remain for 3 days until it was repaired. I became very curious that day to occupy my time with something alternative until the window returned to its previous state. I began searching around the house, perhaps finding something to entertain me during those 3 days. It was lonely, so the search led me to the top floor of our house, and from there I headed to a room I had never thought of entering. My father's office. I cannot describe my feeling that day when I opened the library door, but it was closer to someone discovering a treasure buried in the courtyard of his house. The treasure was a collection of books, magazines, tapes, and documents that my father had collected over the years. His studies in America were all arranged in a huge glass cupboard and arranged with great care. The reading table was like what you find in a meeting room, with a model of the globe sitting on top of it and a real leather wheelchair in its center. I felt that the world was in my hands. And even though the books, magazines, and tapes were all in English, I enjoyed it with passion and loved reading and listening to the songs of singers of the 60s and 70s while browsing my first copy of Time magazine, which was there. And while I was here, I found in that library the magic carpet that enveloped me in the world through pages of paper and through some musical tunes that took me to the first culture. In seconds, I felt lucky that most children my age would not have benefited from this great treasure without the language that I possessed, the cultural and intellectual preparation that was instilled in me, and the freedom that was granted to me in browsing that library. I finished reading my first encyclopedia in a few days, and I was just a child in. At 10 o'clock, I delved into sciences that I did not understand at that time, because my father loved to acquire books in all fields, and he had a special collection that was locked in a black diplomatic bag. I was able to open it later. After several months, the television returned to the house after the 3 days had passed, and I did not pay any attention to it as before. I found what is my legacy and richest. So I navigated the oceans of that library without stopping until I graduated from primary school. At that time, I did not find the academic curriculum attractive, which had an adverse effect on my level of academic achievement. I was not stupid, but I was not interested. I did not have many friendships in that time. This stage of my life is not because I am introverted, but I was not attracted to children my age, as their topics were far removed from the topics that might stimulate my slightest interest, and I saw their interest as extremely superficial, despite my repeated attempts to integrate with them. At that stage, I began reading local literature, but it also did not attract me due to the difference in style and strength in presentation from its counterparts on the Western side, but I was attracted to literature and I read for my longing a lot. I don't know why, but he is the poet who caught my attention the most and attracted me to what he wrote. Days passed, and I lived with a mind different from those around me. Not necessarily smarter, but certainly different. My daily and continuous reading of those books in my father's library was a major factor in the crystallization of my personality and the occurrence of what resembled early puberty in his mind. I loved analyzing personalities because there were many samples and those around me. I remember when I was about 12 years old, I was suffering from a stomach problem. This pain was recurring, and all the doctors and consultants who took me could not find a cure. To them is my father, and because of my mother's concern for him and the failure of modern medicine to provide a solution to his chronic condition, my mother decided to go to a sheikh who specializes in reading for people, and although my mother would not have knocked on this unknown door or thought about it, she was not denying the Quran and its ability, God willing, to heal people, but rather doubt and lack of confidence in me. They practiced reading, but in the end they succumbed to pressure her relatives and their insistence and high recommendations against this virtuous sheikh. We went out with my father after my mother urged us and went to a person who was called the Omani Sheikh to begin treatment sessions with him. My father would take us to an area whose houses were made of mud so that my mother and I would cover the rest of the distance on foot through old, dilapidated houses that were. It was a new environment for me at that time. Its streets had a distinctive smell. On the first visit, I was not aware of our destination, but with repeated visits, I was eager to go because I liked those mud houses for some reason. We were waiting for the sheikh in a small room full of women and children, and we rarely saw a man among them. And this was the wait. It extends for periods. It was a long time during our first visit before my mother realized the mechanism by which this place worked, which was money. We obtained VIP passes for every visit. After my mother realized this mechanism, money flowed into the hands of everyone who would take us to the sheikh quickly, and in the end. After several customs points, I do not sit in front of him for 5 minutes, during which my mother quickly tries to explain my condition with worry on her face. While he has his eyes closed, his hand is on my head, and he mumbles some words that are not clearly audible, and I look at him with a mixture of fear and amazement. The meeting usually ends with him spitting in my face and in a bottle of oil or water, and we left quickly and hastily as if we escaped from a crime scene. My mother's visits to the sheikh continued, and the sessions of spitting in my face continued until my mother suddenly stopped going to him. To be honest, I was accustomed to those visits that took me out of the house. I was not one of the children who was allowed to go out much, so these therapeutic appointments were a nice change after several weeks. Our visit to the sheikh was interrupted, so I asked my mother, saying, "Why don't we go to the sheikh anymore, Mother?" My mother responded with a response that I did not laugh at until years later when I grew up and understood what she was saying. She said with sadness, "The police arrested him. I never imagined that my mother was educated, and she visited more than 20 countries around the world. She would end up in prison. He took her son to a man, he spits in his face, and you pay him a handsome sum in return." This situation, when I recalled it in my memory one day, prompted me to think, and it raised in the mind of the moving person a question. Why? Why did my mother do that? Why did I go to that charlatan who drowned me with his oils and his leg? I could only find one answer: fear. Yes, it is fear. Fear stripped her of her mind and logic and stripped her of all means of self-defense. Fear was that man's weapon to blackmail people for their money and sometimes their honor, and no one was able to discuss it because he was wearing a cloak that gave him all the powers and immunity that religion needs. This topic remained in my mind until I was 20 years old, age and become focused. Out of interest and concern in my mind, I observed the members of society around me, and I developed the theory of fear for measurement and experimentation more than once, and this theory never failed me. I tried to explain to people through logical discussion that the blind trust they give to some who disguise themselves in the cloak of religion contradicts the instinct of caution and fear, which are among the basics. I stayed with them, but the influence of the beard, the short dress, and the smell of oud oil was stronger than my logic. However, I had hoped to achieve a change in the prevailing pattern of thinking towards the mutashiks. But when I reached the university stage, I discovered that my society suffers from a misunderstanding of the meaning of understanding. In other words, that there is an evaluation. Evaluate a person's mind before he opens his mouth, and evaluate his morals before he deals with you. I did not understand this system and had not read about it before in any book. I adapted to my society by adhering to my concepts and principles and became confident in ignoring those who chose to be ignorant. Some people criticized my citing Einstein because he was Jewish. He accuses me of stupidity because I admire Hitler's Nazi mentality. The imposed norm here was that everything outside the borders of my national geography should not be dealt with except with contempt and regret. They are the lost, and we are the survivors. Even my friendships with adherents of some other religions and those with different sects were seen by some as a high betrayal of the organization that, you will enter heaven in its broadest terms. I do not deny that I tried to adopt this thought during a period of my life as a way to adapt and experience the new. But I was unable because the demands of my mind were greater. I was accused of heresy and hypocrisy more than once by a number of scholars for reasons that were not religious at all. Then I started to think until I came to my own conviction, which is that a fool is like being naked in front of people, and he will cover himself with anything in his way in order to conceal his foolishness. There are those who choose silence, and I respect this type. And there are those who choose to attack your person so that people will pay attention to you and turn their attention away from his exposed private parts. And this is unfortunately the case. The condition of many people in the community, idiots. Some people confuse ignorance with stupidity and believe that ignorance is as reprehensible as stupidity. And they do not realize that we are all ignorant of something in one way or another, and no one knows all knowledge except God. So the word ignorant is a description of a lack of knowledge, but stupidity is a description of a lack of ability to absorb knowledge. And this is more dangerous in that case. The stage of my life, at the height of my mental thirst for knowledge, changed the course of my life and forever. I did not tell what happened to me to anyone because I did not find an explanation for those events that any mind in this time would accept. To be clear from the beginning, I am not waiting for acceptance or rejection from anyone, and I will narrate what I went through just for the sake of it. Documentation. Perhaps one day after I die, what I wrote will be looked at like this. Looking at the writings of the one who first said that the earth is round, he and his writings were burned, and the truth of what he wrote did not emerge until many centuries later. What I will mention in the following pages of events, stories, and novels, I will not ask anyone to believe them, nor will I claim that they are real, in order to protect myself from the voice of criticism. Likewise, I will not say that it is a novel of my imagination so as not to be unfair to an important part of my life forever, but I will suffice by saying that it is just Israeli women. The day that changed my life, we were visiting a relative, and the gathering was crowded with men of all ages. As usual, I was discussing mountain topics warmly and clashing with anyone. I don't like my opinion or enter my mind, and I would love to hear it. Expressions of praise from those around me. When I was one of the arrogant people who claimed knowledge in front of the council members just because they had a social or economic status, making them believe that they were authorized to speak in any field or topic, I was satisfied with looks of pride and admiration from my father in particular, some of my relatives, and the council members in general. Phrases such as, "You are old enough," or "God willing I will burn them," were the beloved coronation of his heart in every debate battle he won. There is no doubt that there were some petrified minds that were nesting in those gatherings, like old crows that refuse and forbid the young birds to sit on a weak branch on that tree. And it yelps at everyone who tries approaching her, no matter how much she hits her with the anvil of logic or the hammer of conclusive evidence. She will never admit her ignorance, but she is satisfied with funny, provocative responses and expressions like, "Thank God for Islam," or "We only know the Quran and the Sunnah." The one who was talking to them had just come from the Wailing Wall. I was used to it. I followed this outdated method of escaping dialogue and rational debate, but I was upset at the looks of support and acceptance from some of those whom I considered to be among the rational people in the council. As if with this support, they were buying their comfort and saving themselves from an inevitable classification that would isolate them from that group that controls our esteemed council and place them in a list known today as liberalism. And this name, unfortunately, has been used with those to whom it applies and those to whom it does not. Not to mention phrases such as, "Would you like it for your sister?" and other usual means of escaping any logical discussion. I am almost certain that some of you will stop reading now because he has issued a judgment against me that I despise those who are around me and see them as inferior, and carry the torch of liberation and openness to lead people with it, or at the very least a poster or source for religions from just a few lines. Although I did not touch upon religion at all, I did touch upon people, and here lies the real problem that I face with my mind that does not want to stop thinking, as it is not in my nature to sanctify people, or putting them in the category of infallible people. The most they can get from me is mutual respect and uplifting discussion. And this in itself is an unattainable dream with some of us who are considered thinkers and rational people, and who have not strayed or rise above anything other than the simplest ABCs of dialogue etiquette. What you hear from me, it is not the voice of the ego, the voice of who you are to determine how I should be. Let us return to the council, which was filled with incense smoke, announcing the end of the session. There was an angry look from my uncle when I said that lighting incense is one of the most important components that Hindus use in many of their ceremonies and rituals. I must learn not to talk about constants in the future, our worries. When I left, before I reached the door of the council, one of my relatives called me. He was very old and nearly 70 years old. He gestured to me with his hand, so I went to him because, frankly, I prefer to talk to the elderly because they contain a lot of old wisdom that I would like to imbibe from them before they leave this place. The elderly relative said to me, "Do you want to talk?" The question was strange, but the answer was definitely yes. He said, "Stay with me for a little while until the people leave." I sat with him until the people left, including my father, whom my brother took with him in his car, which he had just started learning to drive because the house was the house of the son of the man who asked to talk. With me, he has been staying with him for a while, in a place where there are people, and he asked for permission. The man's son went upstairs and said to me, "It is your place, take your rest." I looked at the elderly relative with his gaze. "Give me what you have." He surprised me with a question and said, "Do you believe in the other world?" I was surprised by his question and asked him the reason for the question in the first place. He said, "I heard you in the council discussing Abdul Rahman and saying that you are attached to superstitions. He is the one who made you think this way." So I said, "Yes, superstitions." We were discussing the story of that magician who came to read to that poor woman after he convinced her that she was possessed. In the end, he harassed her. He asked me and said, "What is the superstition in the matter, magic or reading or what?" So I remained silent. It is rare for me to remain silent, and my tongue is tied due to my inability. About the response, I said to him I meant other things, and he said, "Like what?" So I remained silent again as I stared into his eyes that were waiting for my answer. I did not like the siege I was in, so I said without thinking, "The world of jinn, demons, and possession." This specific speech did not enter his mind. He said, "Do you know the verse mentioned in Surah An-Naml, which says, 'An evil among the jinn said, I will bring it to you before you rise from your position, and I am strong and trustworthy over it.' The one who has knowledge of the book said, 'I will bring it to you before your limb returns to you.' When he saw it settled with him, he said, 'This is from the bounty of my Lord, that he may test me whether I am grateful or ungrateful. And whoever is grateful, he is grateful only for himself. And whoever disbelieves, then surely my Lord is rich and generous. God Almighty has spoken the truth.' I said, 'Yes, I know what is wrong with her.' And he said, 'Who are they?' 'The two people competing to bring the throne of Bilqis to the prophet of God, Solomon, in the verse.' So I said, 'Two of the jinn, of course.' He said, 'Are you fluent in religion or the science of interpretation?' So I told him frankly to him, and I have no desire to do so. He said, 'Why?' So I said, 'There is no hatred in religion, and God forbid. But I rarely see or find anyone who discusses normal topics with me calmly, let alone religion.' I gave him an example of that and said, 'I was once praying the evening prayer in the blessed month of Ramadan, and I left without praying Taraweeh and returned home feeling tired. And after the people finished praying, they met with some friends, and one of them had. I saw me leaving the mosque before Taraweeh, and that person raised the issue in front of everyone by saying, "May God guide you for what you did tonight." I said to him, "Who did you do?" He said, "I committed a great sin." I said, confirming his confident statement, "It is good, God willing." He said, I left the congregational prayer for him. I prayed the evening prayer with the group. He said, "I do not mean prayer. Isha, rather. I meant the Taraweeh prayer." So I laughed without realizing it. He shouted at me saying, "You are laughing at God's law." I said, "No, but I am laughing at your stupidity." He got angry and said words that I would not dare to repeat. When I tried to explain to him that Taraweeh is a sunnah, and whoever abandons it is not sinful, his voice rose and he said, "This is no excuse." And he began attacking me and talking to me as if I had. I just left Islam and I don't want to go back. Frankly, I do not hide from you that the discussion with him was very exhausting because it is like talking to a blind and deaf person. Even when I told him that Taraweeh prayer at home is no less rewarding than praying it in the mosque, according to some jurists, he accused me of heresy and nothing remained of my atonement except a word that I see coming in the future. The end of the conversation, and the funny thing about it, is the group that gathered around him and was trying to calm him down by saying, "Calm down, Sheikh." I saw myself in an intellectual conflict, someone who had no thought at all, and with the repetition of such examples and fruitless clashes when the discussion was related to religion, I chose not to agree with him or go deeper. There is more than one need as an ordinary Muslim because my freedom is in me saying my opinion has been stolen from the beginning, and I will not be able to speak without passing through a field of mines for which God has sent down no authority. The man was silent for a few seconds as he stared at me. Then he said, "Do I understand from that you deny the existence of the jinn?" I told him, "Don't be clever with him. If you deny sex, you will say that I denied the Quran and the discussion will end with me accusing me." He said to him, "I will not do that." Then I said, "Then I mentioned to you that those who were competing to bring the throne of Bilqis to the prophet of God, Solomon, were from the jinn. So how did he deny them?" He responded to me with words about the focus of the conversation with him and changed my life forever. He said, "But the person who said to the prophet of God, 'Ask me, I will bring it to you before your limb returns to you.'" It was not a jinn, so I was silent in astonishment. Then I said, "How can it not? He would be one of the jinn. What would he be if a man like me and you said, 'But he was given knowledge of the book'?" So I said to him, "What is this knowledge of the book that gave humans the ability to surpass the jinn and bring the throne of Bilqis before the side of the prophet of God, Solomon, returned to him?" He said, "The commentators differed in interpreting the meaning, but they agreed that he was a man. He has power and knowledge that exceeds the jinn and humans, and the source of his power was the knowledge of the book. Others interpreted it to mean that the man himself was the prophet of God, Solomon, and the dialogue was between him and that jinn." I looked at him and said, "Is this interpretation yours, or is it agreed upon?" He said, "Most of the interpreters interpreted it that way." I said, "What are you trying to say?" And he said, as he smiles, "There is another world, a world he does not know about. Many people have a mysterious world of jinn, demons, magicians, and other dimensions that live around us and between us, and many things that people deny, either out of fear of them, ignorance of them, or both." So I told him, "But I don't believe it, and I rarely deny something before investigating it, but what you are saying is crazy." So he said, "Is it true? You want proof?" So I said, "I smiled, and what are you going to do?" He said, "I will make you see them with your own eyes and hear them with your ears." I laughed and said, "Finally, someone is offering me tangible proof. Go ahead, give me what you have." He said, "Are you confident in what you say? Do you really want to enter this world?" I said mockingly, "I am eager for that." He got up and said, "Okay, wait for me here." He went. The old man went to his room and then returned with a book in his hand and placed it in my hand. And he said, "Remember, this was your decision." I took the letter and said goodbye to my relative. He thanked me for his hospitality, and during my handshake with him, before I let go of his hand, he squeezed my hand tightly and said, "Remember, it was you who chose." So I smiled at him with a smile mixed with anxiety because his face was worried, as if he was regretting giving. The book I rode my car on my way home, and I was thinking about the words of the old relative and the word science of the book specifically, and I was saying to myself, can reading a book or two books or even a few books make a human being superior to one of the sons of the jinn? During this thinking and brainstorming, I began to recall some limited memories about. The old relative remembered that he was an introverted and unsociable man. He is sociable and taciturn. He rarely discusses and participates in the debates that are thrown in the council from time to time, but if he spoke and decided to participate, the audience remained silent. I also remembered that he lost one of his sons in a traffic accident, and that he was also receiving treatment for a long period at home and abroad. I did not remember the illness that caused him. He was suffering from it at the time, but then he moved to live with his eldest son after his wife died a few years ago. I entered the house and went directly to the room. I was very exhausted from the long day, so I threw the book on the table and my body on the bed and fell into a deep sleep. I woke up in the morning and entered into my daily routine of getting ready to go for university, and I did everything I used to do, including evening visits to my friends and some occasional occasions. I forgot about the book that the old relative had given me for more than a month. The fateful night. I returned home late one night after a long night out with my friends, but sleep had deprived me that night, and I could not sleep. Despite many attempts, I noticed the book that had been lying on the table for more than a month, and it had collected some dust on its untitled cover. I went to the book, brought it to my lips, and blew on it. I had forgotten about it. I lay down on my bed and began to leaf through it out of boredom for interest. The book did not have the name of an author, index, publishing house, or even pagination was. The book was strange, with no title on its cover or inside, and its contents looked like a blog. The paper was slanted and its edges were frayed. I opened the book from the middle and began to browse it. I did not understand anything of what was written in it. The words written on its pages did not have a meaning that would attract my attention. I tried to read more carefully and with more concentration, but the book seemed very ordinary to me. It talked about spirituality and the other world, and things that I saw at that time as ridiculous and just imagination and nothing more. So I did not finish the book and threw it on the table next to me and went straight to sleep. That night, I dreamed of a person with a white beard wearing a short white dress with pockets and a small white hat. It almost covered his head, and he was telling me to finish what I started, and he started repeating it until I woke up from sleep with heavy and rapid breathing, even though I was not that alarmed, and that was around 2 o'clock in the morning. I don't remember why, but my eyes fell on the book, even though the book was not there. It contains pictures in which I felt an urgent need and desire to search for that man who had disturbed my dream. So I opened the book and did not read all the pages, but rather browsed through it like a magazine until I fell asleep and could no longer distinguish the words. I went back to bed and fell asleep again. The same person visited me in a dream a few minutes after I fell asleep, but this is it. This time he looked angry, and his face was angry. He frowned and came closer to my face than before and shouted at me, saying, "Continue." I woke up terrified this time and headed to the door of the room, and from there quickly downstairs, heading outside to my car. I tried to start it quickly in order to get away from the house and waste time until the morning, but the car did not start, and I did not connect it. While it happened in the dream at that time, and I returned to my room hesitantly. I climbed the stairs slowly, my gaze directed toward my room's door, and I began to doubt whether my room's door was open when I left or closed it. I began to worry and think about side matters. My focus was due to the fear that gripped me. I entered the room again, directed my gaze to the book, and said to myself, I will read it completely this time. I picked up the book and read it from cover to cover. After I finished the book, I put it aside and took a deep breath and said to myself, I did not understand anything. The book was written in a simplified language and sometimes in a language closer to short poems, but the last line in it was the only line that caught my attention. It confused me a little. The last line said, "You will never see the world you live in the same again after today, because I will be with you." That phrase did not mean anything to me at the time, but it was clearer than others mentioned in the book. After reading it, I felt contradictory feelings that I cannot describe. It was more like a mixture of distressed anxiety. Out of nowhere, I put the book aside and came back. I went to sleep and tried to forget what had happened. I woke up to the sound of the dawn call to prayer, which was comforting and soothing to me. I got out of bed and went to the bathroom to perform ablution in order to perform the prayer. I did not usually perform the dawn prayer, but hearing the call to prayer after I passed it that night removed the fear from my chest and made me want to go to the mosque. My eyes were half closed, searching for the bathroom door handle, and I could still clearly hear the call to prayer. But shortly after I entered the bathroom and closed the door, and specifically in the middle of ablution, I realized that the sound I was hearing was not coming from outside, but rather it was from inside my room. So I looked at the clock and found that it was prayer. Fajr had ended 10 minutes ago, and I was still hearing the sound of the call to prayer. I broke my ablution and stood in the bathroom in fear until the call to prayer coming from my room ended, and before I could think of grabbing the handle to open the door, I heard another voice saying, "Establish the prayer." The owner of the voice grew bigger and began reading in a loud voice. Clear of the mountains, I sat on the edge of the toilet and heard the dawn prayer being performed in my room. My panic increased when the reader reached me and the lost ones responded. And then a group voice responded with him saying, "Amen." Whoever was or were in the room continued their prayer, and I was not able to leave the bathroom and remained there for about an hour. The water cycle after the sun rose from the sky, and the time for his lecture approached. The first time, I went and got ready like any other morning, and then I left the house and headed to the university. I got in my car and the engine ran smoothly. It did not occur to me that the malfunction that happened yesterday was a coincidence or something else. I was just confused and headed directly to the university. Until the end of the day, I returned a little before sunset because I had not. I returned home directly that day, and when I entered my room, I remembered what had happened to me yesterday, and my heart was a little upset. But I ignored the matter. When it became 9 o'clock, I decided to leave the house like every day. So I went to the bathroom to shower, and moments after entering the bathroom, I heard a sound that I will never forget. I heard the sound of a small child crying, and the sound was coming from my room, and in only at this moment did I realize that that book had been opened to me with good news, and the matter was not just illusions. The sound of crying stopped after a minute or a little more, and I quickly left the bathroom and the room heading to my car, and I started the engine while saying to myself, "What happened?" I was on my way to my friends. I used to meet them every night, but I found myself heading to the house of a relative who gave me the book. I knocked on the door, and his son opened it for me. I asked about his father, and he told me that he was sleeping, so I told him to wake him up for an urgent matter and that I must meet him. The son reluctantly agreed and invited me to enter the council and asked me to wake up his father. My relative entered upon me. With sleep still in his eyes, he said to me, "What do you want?" I told him what happened to me from the first day until the moment I came to him. He responded to me with a strange coldness and said, "But what you say is just myths." So I swore to him that this is what happened to me. So he said, "What do you want from me now?" So I told him that I want an explanation for what is happening, because these things did not happen until after reading it. For the book he presented to me, he said, "I have not slept at this time for 40 years, and today for the first time I have made you sleep with stone. I am sorry, my son, but now you will live with those who lived with me all those years." I shouted at him and said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I do not mean anyone." Then he got up and left me alone in the council. I left confused and afraid to return home, so I called my family and said, "I will not come back tonight, and I will spend the night with someone." My friends, I went to the nearest hotel, and it was that night there. And in the morning, I returned home to take my diaries and go to university, and I found my room upside down and in complete chaos. And when I asked my family about the reason for this chaos, they said that no one had entered it since you left yesterday. I stood and watched the chaos of the room, and I remember the old man's words last night, and I remember the look of relief in his eyes to get rid of the worries and problems he suffered from for many years. I kept tidying the room and did not go to university that day. Nothing was broken, but most of my belongings were upside down or thrown on the ground, so I took it and started turning its pages. But this time, for a reason I don't know, I started to understand the words, understand the meanings, and link them together. So I sat reading it eagerly until noon, and after I finished reading, I realized only then what had happened to me. It was mentioned in one of the pages of the book. One of the pages mentioned that whoever reads this book will be linked, but he did not mention what. But he mentioned that the link will not be broken unless, when another person reads the book and he wants to do so with complete conviction, I realized that the thing that was connected to me is what made that old man not sleep for all those years. I flipped through the book looking for another way to break the connection, but I did not find anything between those worn pages. I returned that night to the old man's relative and sat down. With him, although he initially refused to meet him, I was pleased his son persuaded him to meet him, and when he submitted to my insistence and I sat down to talk to him, he confirmed all his conclusions to me, so I told him, "Why did you do that to me?" He said, "The choice was yours and I did not force you to do anything." So I asked him if there was a way to get rid of them without throwing them at someone else, so he said. I searched for many years and did not find a solution to this problem, so I suggested Ruqya to him as a solution to this problem. And he said, "Try it, for God is capable of everything." We were silent for a few minutes, then I asked permission to go out, and before I left, he told me to try the Koran, so I said, "What is the Koran?" He said to me, "A devil who has been with you since you were born, and he has no power or authority over you, other than the obsession. But if you release it, it may expel everyone around you from the jinn." So I told him, with sarcasm, "And since you did not try it," he said, "I read more than one book about him and his brutality, and when he is released and freed from his owner, I preferred to stay with those with me, especially since at that time I began to get used to their presence." So I told him how to free him. He said to me, "Are you sure of your request?" I told him. "Do I have another choice?" He said, "Wait here for a little while and I will come back." The old man disappeared for quite a while, and I sat waiting for him while I was turning over that book that opened the gates of hell to me. Then he came back and gave me another book and said to me, "I do not advise you to read it, as I did not dare to do that, but you are free to do what you do." So I took the book from him and said, "God suffices me, and he is the best disposer of affairs." I headed home thinking about his words, the first book, and the second book until I arrived. I went to my room and did not open the second book. I went directly to bed, and shortly after I fell asleep, I woke up to a sound resembling a faint whistling in my ears. I woke up in fright, and the sound stopped immediately. I tried to go back to sleep after that, but I could not. After an hour of repeated attempts, I was able to go back to sleep and woke up to another sound resembling the hissing of a snake coming from under my bed, and in the same way, the sound stopped when I woke up. I went back again and woke up to a sound and did not go back to sleep after that. It was the sound of loud laughter coming from the bathroom, and the sound did not stop even after I woke up. Because I was a young man in my early 20s, I did not memorize memories, all of them, and I was not reading the Quran a lot. So this thing did not occur to me at that time, so I stayed in bed, hugging my pillow, terrified, carefully watching the bathroom door until the laughter stopped. I left the room immediately after the laughter stopped and headed downstairs, and I found my younger brother standing in the middle of the kitchen looking. To me, while he was smiling, I spoke to him, and he did not answer him, so I approached him and put my hand on his shoulder. I was shocked by something that looked like electricity and fell to the ground. I did not wake up except to my father's voice in the morning saying, "Get up." I quickly headed to my room, and my father followed me with fear in my mind about the situation he found me in. I told him, "Don't worry, no." She took the second book and went out into the courtyard of the house. I sat in the garden and opened the book. And before I could read a word from it, my mother called me and said, "Aren't you going to university today?" So I said to her out loud, "No." And this is the first time I have spoken to her in this way. I am not naturally hot-tempered, and my mother was the only person in my life who I could not talk to. I would oppose her words no matter what she asked or raise my voice to her, but this time my mind was out of place because of the fear that gripped me. My mother went away and did not answer me, and despite my remorse at the same moment, I could not catch up with her and apologize to her because my mind was busy searching for a solution to what happened. When I was there, I was like an addict looking for a dose to stop his pain, the one who cuts off his limbs. I hurriedly opened the book, and it was as before, without an index, page numbers, publishing house, etc. But the number of pages was fewer, and its cover was black. The book was written in a strange format. They were addressing me as if he knew me, and he was talking about my peers as if he were a brother to me and the friend he longed to meet. And when I reached the preparation page and found at the top of the pages a word that was different from the rest of the words of the book. That word was the only one in the book that was written by hand. It said, "Jinn, who is looking for a potion to stop the pain that is dismembering his limbs." I did not pay any attention to it at that time, even though it caught my eye, and I continued reading. The method mentioned in the book to prepare my horns requires the absence of the sun as one of the elements of preparation. So I waited until the sun had set and then went straight to my room, then to the bathroom, and closed the door, because I also needed the woman as one of the elements of preparation, as the book said, and I carried out to the letter what was written on the preparation page, and the process was tiring and exhausting, but after finishing it, nothing happened. I left the bathroom, and the room was quiet in an unprecedented way. I felt afraid because the quiet was unusual. Even the sound of the street, through which I was accustomed to hearing the voices of neighbors, passers-by, and cars, I did not hear it. I only heard my breathing, the beating of my heart, and the sound of my saliva that I had swallowed. From stress, I went to bed after that and slept through the disturbance that night. The next night, I expected that I would face that disturbance and harassment that would begin as soon as I went to bed. But for the second time, nothing happened. The atmosphere was calm and the place was quiet. This happened again the third night as well, and the situation continued like that for a month until I completely forgot about the matter. I remembered the events at the moment when we received news of the death of the elderly relative who had given me the 2 books. To be honest, I did not grieve for him much. We went to the cemetery to bury him, and I was very envious of him for what he did to me, to the point that I did not pray for his forgiveness during the prayer for the dead, but I forgave him and prayed for his forgiveness when I saw his body coming down the ground was wrapped in a piece of white cloth. When we started to turn to the ground, my shoulder collided with the shoulder of a strange-looking man. He looked at me with a strange look and smiled at me with an even stranger smile. People began to leave, and it was afternoon, so I headed with my father to the car, and before I got in, I heard a call behind me saying, "Wait, wait." So I looked in the direction of the sound was like this. This stranger who I met at the grave was going to wait for me with his hand, and he smelled of a suffocating perfume. I remember his smell. It was pungent, like vinegar, but it was more like the smell of basil. I kept staring at that man until he lowered his hand from my shoulder, which was stained with the dirt of the grave. He smiled and said, "I'll see you tonight." Then he turned his back and left. I stood next to the car with the door half open, and one foot was in the car and the other was resting on the street. In order to raise my head to look at that man while he was gone, I noticed that he had returned to the cemetery and was not heading to the street or to a car. While I was looking at him, my father shouted and said, "Come on, I got in the car." I asked my father about that person and said to him, "Who is this man, Father?" He told me that he did not know him and had never seen him before, but he had. He was a friend of the deceased, as he traveled a lot to many distant countries when he was searching for as a treatment for the illness that afflicted him. So I said to his father, "What was our relative suffering from before he died?" My father said, "Are we going to stay under the heat of the sun for a long time?" He started the car and moved, and I will tell you on the way. I started the engine of the car and kept my eyes on the cemetery gate, wanting to catch a glimpse of that strange man. But I did not. I found an impression on him when I passed in front of her. I opened a conversation with my father by asking him what our relative was suffering from. My father said frankly that I did not have a close relationship with him, but all I know about him is that he was a self-made man myself, and he excelled in his studies. He worked in a government job until he got married, and then he suddenly decided to submit his resignation and go into business. I interrupted my father and said, "Did he fail in it?" My father said, "Quite the opposite. His business succeeded in record time, and he became one of the well-off. And at one time, he enriched the wealthy family." I said, "But their current house does not indicate their wealth. Rather, he lives with his son and does not have his own home." My father said, "Let me continue and do not interrupt me." I said, "Excuse me." "Go ahead, father," he said. My father, our relative at the peak of his success and wealth, decided to open branches of his business in some Gulf countries, and he actually began establishing those branches and supervising them from time to time, traveling alone or sometimes accompanied by his wife and children. And on one of those trips in which he was alone, and according to what his wife told him later, he returned. His temperament changed, and he became tense and moody. He began to neglect his business and no longer left the house as before, and with the passage of time his business began to collapse, had his wife not obtained power of attorney from him, and sold all the assets and seized as much money as she could. We stopped at that moment at a traffic light, so I turned to my father and said, "What happened?" After that, he said, "My father remained the same. Rather, his condition worsened. He would disappear for long periods of time and suddenly return without mentioning to anyone where he was or what happened to him. His children grew up and accepted the idea that their father had lost his mind. During those years, his wife spent a lot of money trying to treat him, but she did not sit in bankruptcy and debt and did not get out of those wealth except in that house where his son got married." The green light came on, and I only noticed the sounds of the car alarms behind me. So I moved quickly and said to my father, "What is the story of the death of one of his sons?" My father said, "On one of the times our relative was absent from the house, a call came to their house and informed them. The caller said that their father was in a Gulf country and they wanted them to come to receive him. So his eldest son went out and booked a ticket for that country. And after traveling for hours, their father entered their house, and as usual, he was relaxed and in a deplorable state. He denied his presence in that country and went to his room very coldly and closed the door. I said to my father, "What about?" His son said he called from that country and said they told them that he did not find his father, and those who called them said that he left suddenly. So his mother told him that his father had been in the house since yesterday. The son told them not to let him go out until he returned because he wanted to tell them something important. So I said to his father, "And what did he say to them when he returned?" My father said, "Why?" "He came because he died in a traffic accident while coming from the airport." I said, "There is no power nor strength except with God." "What happened after that?" My father said, "Nothing. The man stayed with his wife and second son in that house until the son grew up and got married. The mother died a few years after her son's marriage." I returned home thinking about my father's words about our relative, and his picture of that strange man never left my imagination, and I don't know why, but As soon as we arrived and entered the house, I looked for Al-Qurain's book, and when I found it, I opened it, and the man left, walking on his feet, and I stood up after that. He remained silent for a period of time and watched him leave until he disappeared from sight. I sat in the car and held the steering wheel and did not move for quite a while. I was afraid to start the car, and I did not know why, but in the end, I tried starting the engine as a last attempt, and what happened suddenly, I entered my friends before. It was 5 minutes past 10 o'clock in the evening. Unusually, I was quiet and rarely spoke or participated in conversation. Some of my friends were playing cards, and while they were playing, he turned to one of them and said, "There is someone who asked about you before you came." I told him who I asked, and my heart tells me that he is that strange person whom I met in the cemetery, and that my car broke down, and I thought, his place. My friends told me that he was a strange-looking person with the clothes on the door, and when they opened the door for him, he asked about me by name. They told him that I was on the way and asked him to come in to wait for me, but he refused their invitation and left, saying that I would actually see him tonight. My friends were telling me that while they were laughing at him and mocking his appearance and clothing, they asked me, saying, "Where do you know the shapes from?" And I was smiling as a compliment to them, while in my heart I was afraid of this man and his sudden appearance in my life and his asking about me in this strange way, knowing that I was next to a broken-down car at the end of the night. As usual, I headed home, returned to my room, and lay down on my bed, and before I could hide, I heard a nearby voice. From me it was. The sound is like the sound of something moving on the floor, and even though the place was dark, I felt that someone was watching me or sitting with me. I closed my eyes in an attempt to ignore that feeling, but shortly after that, I started to smell the smell of smoke in the room, so I ignored the smell and did not open my eyes, but the smell. It increased in intensity, and I opened my eyes to find the second book burning in front of me on the table. I quickly got up and tried to put it out, but I could not catch up with it, and nothing remained of it except some ash and burning scraps of paper. I woke up the next day thinking about the events that had happened since I read the first book, so I decided to ask some of the sheikhs. Perhaps I find a solution, or at least an explanation, for what was happening to me at their place. So I started with the imam of the mosque near our house, but I did not find a solution or a satisfactory answer from him. He merely reminded me of some supplications, so I decided to try another mosque, but I did not find anything decisive for my problem. I also continued searching in most of the mosques that I knew and continued. Despair in my chest, and I returned home that day exhausted, looking for a bed to sleep on and forget the trouble of that day, but I did not that night for a single moment. As soon as I put my head on the pillow, I felt a strong hand closing it around my neck and preventing my breathing. My breathing began to decrease, and my eyes began to fill with tears, and I could hear the crackling of the vertebrae. My neck that almost broke from the force that controlled them, and I was certain at that time that I was inevitably doomed. In an instant, the pressure on my neck suddenly disappeared, so I got up from my bed, searching for air like a drowning person who had just emerged from the water. I was searching with my teary eyes around me for the source of this suffocation, but I did not see anything. After I calmed down and caught my breath, I tried to sleep once again. Another time, but the pressure returned to my neck, stronger than before, and I remained in this struggle for a period that exceeded the duration of the first attack. I was kicking the air with my feet several times, desperate for breath, until I thought that this thing did not want me to live and was intent on killing me. The attacks were repeated throughout the night, especially when I was trying to sleep and before. At dawn, within minutes, the attack occurred the last, but this time, during the suffocation process and seconds before he let go of his neck, I heard a voice whispering in my ear saying, "Don't go to the mosques. You are not a worshiper." That ended the final attack, and I went straight to sleep from extreme exhaustion and fatigue. I woke up a little before sunset, and I had traces of the attacks on my neck and shoulders that night. Previously, I sat on the edge of the bed, sad about my situation, thinking in silence. After a while of thinking, I went to the bathroom and hid myself. Then I left the house and went to sit in front of the sea, thinking until it became almost 11 o'clock at night. I did not want to go home because what happened to me yesterday was not an easy thing, and it still is. Its psychological and physical effects are mellow. My memory and my decree were on me, so I decided in a moment of despair to go to the house of an old relative who had died. I arrived at his house around midnight and hesitated to knock on the door at that late hour, but my fear of returning to my room prompted me to knock on the door until his son opened it for me, and when I met him, I made up a story to enter. His father's room, and I told him that his father had borrowed some books from me and I wanted them back, so he reluctantly allowed me to enter. I went to the old man's relative's room and started searching in it like crazy. I searched everywhere and in every corner, and I did not know what to search for, but there was nothing else I could do, so I continued searching until My eyes fell on a box under a pile of clothes, so I pulled it to the middle. The room, and I saw that it was not locked. So I opened it and found in it a group of books and some strange papers and drawings. The books inside the box were all in the same shape as the book that the old relative had given me. I wanted to take from it, but I did not know which of them would be useful to me and which of them. It would harm me, so I decided to leave without taking anything from it. Before I left the old man's son's house, his son said to me, "Why don't you get another one from the same place my father bought it from?" I told him, "I wish I knew that place." He responded with surprise and said, "I thought you knew the source of these books." I said to him nervously, "Tell me quickly, please. Where are you from?" With these books, he took a piece of paper and wrote on it the name of a Gulf country. Then he tore the paper, so I said to him, "Why did you do that?" He said, "I am not a fool to enter your world." So I said to him, "What world?" So he left me and left, and before he left, he said, "Be sure to close the door when you leave." I left his house and headed directly to the airport. I booked the first plane heading to that country, which the old man's son had in that paper, before tearing it up in front of me. I returned home and informed my family that I would be traveling for a short period, and despite my mother's attempts to prevent me from traveling, I did not respond to her and her pleas, and I did not respond to her. But in the end, she was able to force me to make a promise to her that I won't be late, and will come back quickly. I went to my room and took with me the first book and some simple clothes, and went out immediately towards the airport. My father did not know that I was leaving because he was asleep, and so was my brother. Had it not been for the fact that my mother was awake by chance, I did not intend to tell anyone about my departure because I was determined to go and return quickly in a short period of time. More than 3 days I arrived at the capital's airport after less than 2 hours in the air. I landed at the airport and completed all the security procedures. Minutes after leaving the airport door, I realized that I did not have an address, evidence, or anything that would lead me to the source of the book. I only had the first book, so I headed off to the nearest hotel and looked until the morning. I did not sleep much, and I went out wandering around that city with the book with me, and I had no idea about the next step that I should take. After a period of wandering, an idea came to my mind, which was to go to any library. Perhaps it knew the publishing house that published the book, or that it had it. An idea about the author who wrote it. And I actually searched for the largest library there and went to it and presented the writing to one of the officials in the library, who in turn looked at the book and browsed it a little, then looked at me and said, "Where did you get this book?" So I told him most of my story. The office official remained silent, and his facial features changed. Then he broke his silence. He said, "You will not find an author or publisher for this book, but I can guide you for someone who might help you in your endeavor." He gave me a description of an office far from the capital, in another city where I could find something I could find. So I rented a car to go there, but I was asking the whole way due to my ignorance of the area. The sun obscured the horizon, and the color of the sky changed to red, and the night began to spread. His cloak. I wasted a lot of time because of the constant questions I asked on the way, and I had not arrived yet. But in the end, after much trouble, I ended up in that small city, and there I found someone who directed me to that library. After entering it, I found on its shelves books similar to the books I found in a nearby box. The old man, but the bookstore owner, was old. He was short-tempered and refused to talk to me about the book I had with me. He contented himself with guiding me to the house of someone who said he might benefit me in this regard. Despite my fatigue and exhaustion, I decided to continue the journey and not stop. I asked a passerby about the path, and he guided me and said, "The path you should take is mountainous, rugged, and dangerous." At this time of the night, he also warned me of something that I did not understand. He said, "During the way, you will find people who are tall or short in stature, and they will wave to you to stop. Be careful not to stop for them." I continued my way towards the place that the library owner described to me, and I did not see anyone on my way that night. I reached the desired place. At dawn, I found nothing but a simple house on a covered mountainside. It was green, and the house had no neighbors, and it was closer to the shack than to the house. I waited in the car until the sun rose. Then I got out and knocked on the door, and a person about 60 years old with a red beard mixed with some gray and wearing a colorful turban on his head opened it and looked at me aggressively, directing his gaze as if he was watching something behind me, and said, "Come in. Only you, as for him, let him stay outside." The man entered his house and left the door open. I looked behind me and did not see anyone, and I was confused because his house was strange. Most of the furniture in the house was made of wood. The ceiling was a bit high and the place smelled strange. It was like rotting apples, beautiful and disgusting at the same time. I sat in front of him. Before he spoke before me, and he said, "You will not get rid of him easily. Why did I summon him?" He remained silent as I looked at him and did not know what to say. He asked me angrily, "Where is his manuscript?" So I gave him the first book. He angrily threw it in my face and said, "What is this? Where is his manuscript?" I became angry and said to him, "I do not want anything from you." I went to the door and grabbed it. The handle was firmly open and I put my foot on its threshold to exit. The man said while laughing quietly, "Oh God, you are nothing about our world, are you?" So I shouted at him and said, "I do not want to know," he said to me calmly while browsing through the first book. "Keep your feet away from the threshold of the door, boy. If you walk out the door now without him knowing, his name will separate your head from your body in an instant." I said to him, "Who do you mean?" He said, "The devil you summoned. He is waiting for you outside, and he knows now, after I prevented him from entering with you, that you are looking for a way to get rid of him, and he will not leave his place until he kills you." So I said to him, "Why is he killing me?" He said, "Because you came to the place that can make you control him and get rid of him." So I said, "Tell me about it, the way I can get rid of him." He said, "I cannot without the scroll that I used to summon him, and no matter how hard you try, you will not be able to get out of here without knowing the deterrent method for that devil, because he will remain outside waiting for you without falling asleep or getting tired in the summer and winter, even if it takes him to wait for you for a long time. He will not bless his place until he kills you." I swallowed my saliva while looking outside. The door opened and I started to step back, away from the door from which I was only one step away. I said to the man while I was staring out in a faint voice filled with fear, "What should I do now?" He said to me, "Come here, boy, and sit next to me."